I'm Angela.
And I'm Paige.
Join us as we dive into our obsession with true crime, history, and mysterious stories. We'll explore the intricate details of the corrupt, the cruel, and the calculating.
We assume no responsibility or liability for any errors or omissions in the content of this episode. The Corrupt Podcast is based on the facts and our opinions of the case. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to the Corrupt Podcast. Known as the Mad Butcher of Plainfield or the Plainfield Ghoul, Ed Gein left a lasting mark on American society. While the exact number of victims remains unconfirmed, his crimes influence pop culture. Ed was the inspiration for several fictional characters, including Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs.
Before we get started today, we have another Patreon shout out, this time to Chris. Thank you for joining the Corrupt crew.
Thank you, Chris. You're awesome.
Ed's case does involve animal abuse. He also created a skin suit in an attempt to be his mother. Based on that sentence, I think we can all get an understanding of the graphic content that this episode contains.
I'm actually interested to see Charlie Hunman. He's playing Ed in the new season of Monster on Netflix. I think it's the 3rd season. Sons of Anarchy, man. Were you a fan? You were a fan, weren't you?
We were fans.
Rock on.
I'm kind of struggling with it, though, because I can't really see Charlie portraying Ed.
Yeah.
But in 2018, if you had said the same thing to me about Zac Efron and Ted Bundy, I would have also said there's no way. So, fingers are crossed. It's going to be a tough role for him.
He looks nothing like the real Ed, but I do have confidence he'll pull it off because he's an amazing actor.
But Ed was so small.
He was.
And weaselly looking.
There's ways to do that, girl. Production.
We're not that far away. Guess we'll see.
The case of Ed Gein begins with his mother, Augusta. She was an extremely religious woman that believed women were instruments of the devil and sex was evil. She was one of 8 children that were brought up in a very strict household.
On December 4th, 1899, 21-year-old Augusta married George Gein. Their marriage was described as a particularly lacerating nightmare. George was the opposite of Augusta in many ways. He was a blacksmith apprentice for a while, then he sold insurance, before moving on to carpentry, and for a while he worked on the railroad.
George dabbled around with multiple jobs, but wasn't consistent with anything other than heading to the bar after work and drinking away most of his paycheck. Augusta, on the other hand, believed in hard work and frequently belittled George about his lack of work ethic.
The more Augusta lectured George, the less he spoke, until he became almost completely silent in their home. After every night at the bar, George had to face Augusta's wrath when he got home. She shouted at him, and he in turn was physically abusive to her. Augusta would lay on the floor, shouting at him, and then loudly pray for his death. Less than 3 years into their marriage, and it would appear that George and Augusta completely hated each other.
Talk about a toxic marriage right there.
I mean, when they describe it as a particularly lacerating nightmare, that's a horrible description for a brand new marriage.
Yeah. George and Augusta had their first son, Henry, on January 17, 1902. Augusta was incredibly disappointed in having a son instead of a daughter, and distanced herself from Henry. He knew no love or affection from Augusta. Yeah, in this clear view of her, I feel like she's contradicting. Women are instruments of the devil, but oh no, I wanted a daughter, yet she was extremely religious. It's just all over the place.
It is very confusing. It's like all women were evil unless they were related to her. Their second child, Edward Theodore Gein, was born on August 27, 1906. Augusta had prayed every night for a daughter and was even more disappointed in a second son. Unlike Henry, though, she vowed that this son would be different. Ed wouldn't grow up to be lustful and filthy like the other men. She would make sure that he was different.
Known as Ed or Eddie by his family, Ed received more attention from Augusta than Henry. Henry was ignored, but Ed was drowned in overprotection, manipulation, and both physical and mental abuse.
In 1909, the family moved to La Crosse, Wisconsin, and bought a small grocery store. According to Augusta, if George couldn't keep a job, the only other option was to work for himself. Unfortunately, George wasn't the type of guy to run a grocery store, so Augusta took charge of the business in addition to running their home and taking care of the two small children.
From an early age, Ed was taught to worship the ground Augusta walked on. His mother was perfect and never made mistakes. She would tell Ed that only a mother could love him, and even as an adult, he was completely reliant upon her. To Ed, she was flawless, even when she was bitterly mean to him.
After 5 years of hard work, they were able to sell the store and purchase a farm in Plainfield, Wisconsin. The farm was over 100 miles from La Crosse, which delighted Augusta. She considered La Crosse to be full of sin and couldn't get away from the city soon enough.
The small village of Plainfield had a population of just over 900 people in 2020, but in Ed's time the population was half the amount of 450 people. Augusta continued breaking the mold by purchasing the property in her name. George did not own the property, which was very unique for 1914.
The farm, located at the corner of Archer and 2nd Avenue, was 195 acres and almost completely isolated from the outside world. The tiny town of Plainfield was still 6 miles from the Gein farm, and the closest neighbor was a quarter of a mile away.
The family lived in a 2-story farmhouse with an attached summer kitchen on the side of the house.
This summer kitchen was used for canning and putting up food without heating up the rest of the house during the summer months. There was a door connecting the summer kitchen to the regular kitchen.
The house did not have electricity or plumbing. Augusta was proud of her spotless home, and for a while, the property was well taken care of.
George's alcoholism continued, and in addition to Augusta's lectures about purity and the evils of the world, the boys also had to deal with George drunkenly beating them.
When Ed was 8, he began attending a one-room school. He would attend school until he was 16 years old and in 8th grade. Ed had average intelligence but loved to read. Reading was a way for Ed to escape from reality and isolation.
He never fit in with his peers. On the couple of times that Ed started to make a friend, Augusta screamed at him about what a fool he was and how she wouldn't have her son associated with a family like that. She would tell Ed that the other child's father had a questionable past or the mother had loose morals. Always eager to impress Augusta, Ed would immediately stop attempting to form friendships with those children. According to Augusta, the family was not to socialize with the people outside of their home. Everyone around them was the worst kind of sinner.
This was a horrid way to grow up.
And you can clearly see how it warps him later. Like it truly affects him for the rest of his life.
Oh, yeah. After leaving school, Ed's time was spent almost solely on the farm with Henry, Augusta, and George. Life was not easy on the farm. The soil was bad, the crops failed, and the family was impoverished. It took all 4 Geins to keep the farm operational.
The alcoholism took a toll on George's health, and he became completely bedridden for 3 years. At 66 years old, George Gein died from heart failure on April 1st, 1940. Henry was 38 years old, and Ed was 33 years old. George was buried at the Plainfield Cemetery.
Henry and Ed had been drowning in the work around the farm and taking care of George full-time. They weren't particularly sad about his death, but more relieved to have one less thing to take care of.
Neighbors were starting to notice that the farm was looking run down. The interior of the house was still spotlessly clean, but the exterior was showing signs of deterioration, with a patched roof and flaking paint.
After George's death, Henry and Ed took some side jobs to bring in extra money. Ed would work as an occasional handyman and a babysitter. The kids loved Ed, and as an adult, he was more comfortable with kids than other adults. Ed was considered backwards, most likely from his upbringing, but overall quiet and well-mannered. He was viewed as not quite all there, but a nice enough bachelor living on the outside of town. He was only 5 foot tall and walked with a stooped-over back. He also stared at the women in town, making more than one of them very uncomfortable.
During World War II, Ed was required to travel to Milwaukee for the draft physical examination. The 132-mile trek to Milwaukee would be the furthest Ed would ever be from home in his whole life. He failed the physical examination due to a growth on his left eyelid that impaired his vision.
Henry and Ed continued working on the farm and taking odd jobs together. Well into his 30s, Ed doted on Augusta's every need and treated her like a saint. Henry didn't agree with Ed, but never spoke negatively about Augusta until the spring of 1944. Ed was shocked when Henry started to openly criticize Augusta. He couldn't believe that Henry didn't see Augusta as a flawless person to obsess over. Not long after Henry's admission, he would be dead and under fairly suspicious circumstances.
On Tuesday, May 16, 1944, Ed and Henry were burning off some marshland when the fire got out of control. According to Ed, he had gotten separated from Henry, and by the time he managed to get the fire under control, it was dark outside, and he couldn't find Henry. Ed wrangled up a search party, but when they got back to the marshland, Ed led them straight to Henry's body. When it was brought up to Ed about how odd it was that he couldn't find Henry, but then led the search party right back to Henry's body, Ed just simply said, "Funny how that works."
At 43 years old, Henry's cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation without foul play. His body was soot-covered but not burned. He also had bruises on his head that were out of place. At the time, Henry's cause of death was speculated as an accident. Maybe he had passed out from the smoke or had a heart attack and hit his head on a rock. Several years later, investigators would look at Henry's death through a different lens, one that implied Henry's death was more than likely a homicide.
Augusta had a stroke in late 1944. After she was discharged from the hospital, she was completely dependent on Ed for the first time. Ed felt he had an opportunity to prove his self-worth to Augusta, but she never acknowledged his hard work. She told him what needed to be done, and he did it without thanks.
By mid-1945, Augusta had regained some strength and was walking again. Her health would decline again by the winter time, and this time Ed would blame a scandalous situation with the neighbor.
At that time, Ed and Augusta visited a neighbor to buy straw. When they arrived at the neighbor's house, he was beating a puppy with a stick. A woman who lived with the man ran out the door and tried to stop him, but he beat the puppy to death in front of all four of them. It wasn't the animal abuse, but the fact that the woman was living with their neighbor out of wedlock that upset Augusta. According to Ed, this caused her second stroke, and ultimately her death on December 29, 1945. Augusta was 67 years old. In the span of just a couple years, 39-year-old Ed had lost his father, his brother, and the single most important person to him ever, his mother.
That is about the most stupidest reason to have a stroke over and die. The guy was beating a puppy to death, and then she was upset all about the unmarried woman living with him.
Yeah, that lady came rushing out the door to stop him from abusing this puppy, and it's that woman's fault, not the guy beating the puppy to death. The rationale is just so backwards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Ed became even more reclusive. He continued working occasionally as a handyman and pitched in with farmers during harvest. He no longer took care of his own farm, choosing instead to lease some of the land to the other farmers and sell off his animals. The farm fell into disrepair on the outside and inside.
Always a reader, Ed was now living in a dark, filthy, empty house without Augusta directing his every action. His reading material definitely left something to be desired. He was fascinated with the Nazis and their concentration camp tortures. Ed was particularly fascinated with Ilse Koch, a Nazi woman who was accused of collecting heads and using skin for lampshades and book bindings. He also enjoyed reading about cannibals, exhuming bodies, and shrinking of skin to preserve it.
Yeah, not weird at all, Ed. Those are perfect books.
He was obsessive about the Nazis. So, again, in 6 years, he loses all of his family members. He has nobody to direct him. He's sitting in a house that has no plumbing, no electricity, and he's reading obsessive books about the horrendous things the Nazis were doing to people. It is a recipe for disaster.
I wonder if his mom, with the abuse that he got, just mess things up in the head with him, like that he is mentally challenged, and that's why he was the way he was.
I mean, his IQ, we'll talk about that later, but like his IQ is
low.
Normal. Well, it's a little low, but it's not like super low.
Okay.
His upbringing definitely has something to do with it because he does not know how to function. And the babysitting, I think it's because he almost at some point mentally he stopped growing. Like he's still a child. And so he could relate with those children and they thought he was fantastic. And as a parent later, when you find out what your neighbor Ed has been doing and that he was babysitting your children, holy macaroni.
I wouldn't. No, thank you. Yeah.
Just never can trust anyone.
Yeah, you guys don't know, but it's about to get real shitty. Complete shit show here.
Yeah, it's pretty much a dumpster fire from this point on.
Just warning you, because we love you guys.
As if the very strict upbringing, mental, physical abuse, and animal abuse was not enough. Now it's really going to amplify.
Yeah, 100%. Ed rarely left the house, but when he did, one of the only places that he went to was a tavern owned by Mary Hogan. The tavern was located 7 miles away from Plainfield and Pine Grove. It seems like a strange place for Ed to go because Ed wasn't interested in drinking.
He was interested in Mary Hogan, obsessed with her actually. Mary was a German immigrant with an unclear and possibly rough past in Chicago. She had been married multiple times, and there were rumors of mafia involvement during her time in Chicago. Other than being a middle-aged woman and a business owner, Mary was the opposite of Augusta in all ways, and Ed could not understand how Mary could be so similar, but also so incredibly different from Augusta.
On December 8th, 1954, a customer walked into Mary's tavern. He found the place deserted and a pool of blood on the floor. A .32 caliber cartridge lay on the floor next to the pool of dried blood. Based on a blood trail, it appeared to the sheriff that Mary had been dragged across the floor, out the door, and into the parking lot.
There were no witnesses, and due to Mary's unclear background, it was considered possible that someone from her past had attacked her. Her case went cold for several years.
Later, some strange comments that Ed made about Mary's disappearance would surface. One of the farmers who hired Ed as a handyman joked to Ed that if he had tried harder to date Mary, maybe she would be cooking Ed dinner by now instead of missing. Ed replied,
"She's not missing. She's down at the house now."
Ed even told other people that he picked Mary up in his pickup truck and she was at the farm. Ed was always saying strange things that didn't make sense and laughing inappropriately during conversations, so little Eddie's comments were written off.
Makes you wonder what other weird things he was saying that didn't make sense at the time.
Mm-hmm. And I know that I've brought this up before in a previous episode, and I forget which one, but Ed reminds me so much of Arthur from The Joker. How he laughed like uncontrollably. I know you haven't seen it, but like his mother did things to him that was like in forms of abuse. But she was still like trying to be caring and loving, but honestly, she just was not. And that messed with his head quite a bit.
Just like Ed.
And ultimately, it just made him the Joker. Yeah. This is like real life Joker here.
He's the inspiration behind so many things.
It's childhood trauma. That's what it is. It's trauma from some sort of higher, person. Just anybody, really. Uncle,
it's a parent.
Parent.
Yeah. 3 years later, on Saturday, November 16th, 1957, Ed would attack again. That Saturday was the first day of deer hunting season, which was taken very seriously in Plainfield, so most of the men were gone. Ed had planned it that way, hoping for fewer witnesses in the already small village.
Ed had confirmed that 58-year-old Bernice Warden would be alone in the hardware store that she owned by asking her son, Frank, if he would be hunting. Frank and Ed spoke about antifreeze, and Frank confirmed that he would be hunting the following morning.
Frank had noticed Ed in the store more and more frequently, Ed had asked Bernice to the movies, roller skating, and dancing, but Bernice was not interested and declined the invitations.
Ed stopped for kerosene at 8 a.m. on November 16th, then headed towards the warden's hardware store. Bernice was in the store alone, just as Ed had hoped. Arriving at the store, he purchased some antifreeze and left. Moments later, Ed was back, this time asking to look at a rifle. Bernice left Ed to look at the rifle and went to look out the window.
Ed pulled a .22 shell from his pocket and shot Bernice from behind. Ed was convinced that Bernice was evil and she must be punished. A gas station owner from across the street noticed a man driving the warden's hardware truck away from the business between 8:45 and 9:30 a.m. Other witnesses noticed the hardware store was locked up, but assumed it was a quiet day due to the start of hunting season, and Bernice had just decided to close up early.
Ed had a young friend named Bob Hill stop at the farm later that afternoon. Bob's car was having problems, and he asked Ed to drive into town for a new car battery. Ed agreed, but asked Bob to wait outside while he washed the blood off his hands. Bob assumed that Ed had a successful kickoff to hunting season and was dressing down a deer inside. Bob didn't know that Ed never hunted deer and claimed to be squeamish. After running into town for the battery, Ed stayed for dinner at Bob's house. This is where the police would find him just hours later.
At 5 p.m., Frank Warden arrived back in Plainfield. He found the store locked up. Worried about his mother, he went home, grabbed his store key, and arrived back at the store. Once inside, Frank saw the cash register was missing, and there was a blood trail to the back door. From the back door, he discovered the truck was missing as well. Frank was the deputy sheriff, so he didn't panic, but immediately called over to the sheriff Art Schley and Chief Sheriff Arnie Fritz.
While waiting for Arnie and Art, Frank discovered a handwritten receipt for the antifreeze sold to Ed that morning. Officers were dispatched to check Ed's house first, but no one was home. They didn't have a hard time tracking him down at the Hills home because he was known to visit for dinner.
Ed was put in the back of the squad car and asked about his events of the day. When asked to repeat his timeline, the officer pointed out that Ed's story was different the second time. Ed immediately said, "Somebody framed me." When asked who framed him and for what crime, Ed replied, "Well, she's dead, ain't she?" He tried to sound calm, but the officers knew that he had done something to Bernice. They drove him straight to the police station.
That bit caught me by surprise that Frank was the sheriff in town. I was like, oh shit. Ed chose the wrong mom. He chose the wrong mom to mess with.
He really did. So Frank is the deputy sheriff, and I think he was recently hired in as well. But why would you pick anyone on the sheriff department's mom?
I don't know. Just some sick thoughts he had, maybe. Who knows?
Yep. She looked the closest to Augusta.
2 officers headed to Ed's home, hoping to find Bernice Warden alive. They tried one door after another, but all were locked except for the door into the summer kitchen. And I knew from the damn beginning that summer kitchen was going to be a problem. I knew it from the start. I was like, that summer kitchen, it's going to be something.
When I broke it down for you on what specifically a summer kitchen was and how you got into the house through there.
Yes.
Summer kitchens are greatly debated because we don't really have them in our houses anymore.
Mm-hmm.
We don't put up that much food to be worrying about heating the entire house with the canners. But back in the 50s, this would have been a very useful addition on the house for them.
And we'll see how Ed Gein used it here.
Spoilers here, it's not for canning.
Moving around the dark, cluttered area with flashlights, it was Art that bumped into something with his coat. He turned around and showed his flashlight on the gutted, upside-down hanging body of Bernice Warden. Bernice had been decapitated and dressed down similarly to how one would a deer.
The sight was so disturbing that the men ran out of the house and vomited. Then they radioed in what they had found and had no choice but to go back into the house. A crossbar had been run through one ankle, and the other foot was wrapped with cable and attached to the bar. The bar was hung from the rafters, and Ed had used a pulley system to get her body hung up. She had been disemboweled, and her head was missing.
It was so disgusting. Ugh. I struggled with this whole thing, because it's so disturbing.
Those poor officers that walked into that house.
Yeah.
And poor Bernice.
I'm sad to say this, but at least he shot her, and she wasn't alive when he was doing that. Or so we think.
Right. No, she died at the hardware store. I think it was very fast. At least it's still not right, obviously murder, but you're right. At least she wasn't being hung upside down and disemboweled while she was alive.
Yeah. Other officers arrived and a search of the house began. The house was filthy, with trash stacked up in high piles and in incredibly poor condition inside and out. He kept items like old chewing gum and a coffee can. Without electricity or indoor plumbing, the dark, rural house was a nightmare. It was the house of a mentally ill man who had been left alone for too many years.
The filth was nothing compared to what those officers found in Ed Gein's house. In the kitchen, investigators found a sawed-off skull that Ed had been using as a bowl. There were 2 skulls stuck to Ed's bedposts. A shoebox with 9 vulvas was found. Some had been painted silver, wrapped in ribbon, or had been salted for preservation. 4 chairs had the woven seat replaced with human skin. Bracelets and lampshades were also found made from skin. There was a shade pool decorated with lips and a belt made from nipples. A jar was found containing noses. 12 skulls in total were found inside the home.
No wonder why those officers vomited. My God. Ooh.
Yeah, can you imagine? And it's dark in there, like they're there in the middle of the night. They're just finding things with their flashlights. Terrifying.
Can you imagine the smell? Ugh.
Oh, I'm sure it's horrible.
The sight, the smell, the everything. Ugh. Then there were the skin suits and masks. Ed had skinned a woman, preserved it, tied a cord around, and wore the woman's upper torso like a vest. He had skinned a hand and made a glove of sorts from the skin. 9 face masks were found as well. Missing the eyes, Ed had skinned the women's faces but left their hair. He wore their face skin around like face masks. Some of the masks had lipstick applied. The upper torso like a vest. Like, that gets me. The skinning gets me. Anything with the skinning part. And that was Ed Gein in full. Like, that's all he did, I feel like, is just, like, skin these women's faces. And it was disgusting.
Yep. Yeah, he's just impersonating them. Creepiest of all was the bodysuit that he had made. The suit was made from the upper torso and legs of a woman. He had also put one of the vulvas to cover his dick and worn women's panties. Ed would put on the skin suit and walk around his house in the winter and his yard in the summer, pretending to be his mother. When not in use, he stuffed the masks with newspaper and hung them on his bedroom wall.
There's just so many questions. So many questions about that part.
Like, he was literally using the panties to hold the vulva in place and tucking his dick. Like, there's just so much to unpack there that's not right.
No.
So that he could impersonate his mom. And, like, he's just strutting around his yard in the summertime, pretending to be Augusta.
There are so many things wrong with that. Why would you even want to pretend to be your mom? And then why would you want to do all of those things with bodily limbs and extremities and personal parts?
Rotting flesh.
Oh.
You can clearly see why he's the inspiration for Norman Bates. Because I saw Bates Motel. Like, we watched Bates Motel beginning to end, and it's definitely Norman Bates, right?
Yeah, I didn't finish that.
It's worth it.
I did like the show, so I probably didn't get to this part.
It's a trip. You should finish it. It's good.
I need to, yeah. I got a list. Let me tell you, I got a list I need to watch. Okay, so back to this kitchen. Behind the door, an officer lifted a robe to find a brown paper bag underneath. He reached in and actually found the head of Mary Hogan. This solved the disappearance of Mary Hogan.
It's no surprise when officers reached a boarded-up section of the house that they were scared to open it up. What they found was Augusta Gein's bedroom and parlor. It was clear that Ed had sealed off the rooms as a shrine. Her clothes remained in the drawers and her bed was made. Except for the dust, it was like she was still alive and might come back at any time.
By the early morning hours of November 17th, the remainder of Bernice's body would be located. Her heart was in a plastic bag in front of the stove. Her head was found in a bag in the shed, and her entrails were wrapped in newspaper and placed in a men's suit. What is entrails? Can you please explain this to me?
That would be her internal organs. So that could be like her gallbladder, her intestines, her liver.
Ooh, okay. Her head was clearly meant to be a trophy. Ed had run nails through her ears, which he connected with twine as a way to hang it.
At 2:30 a.m., the distraught sheriff arrived at the jailhouse. He grabbed Ed by the shoulder and started slamming him into the wall. Other deputies pulled him off Ed pretty quickly, but instead of getting Ed to talk, he shut down and wouldn't talk at all. I can only imagine how this sheriff felt. Back in the 50s, a crime like this was literally unheard of. But with Ed's history of abuse, shutting down would have been his natural response.
This is unheard of now, don't you think? Like all of this? I mean, I'm thinking like the worst case I can think of is like off the top of my head, Dahmer. That was some shady shit.
But that's the point. It was. But you can think of another serial killer.
I guess, yeah.
Back then, they had no idea, necrophilia, like they had no idea what that was. Or it was like, here's one case that happened during World War II of necrophilia, but then you get Ed Gein in this super rural area. Nobody knows what to do with this. Like the population's so small. This is small town cops. This doesn't happen in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
This is a big town problem. You're like, this could be like an LA thing.
Mm-hmm.
Not a 1950s middle of nowhere Wisconsin case. Everybody was just blown out of the water. And that's, I think, why it's affected American culture so much, is because we were so surprised that this happened in the Midwest.
Yeah, I guess I mean like just how he painted the vulvas like with silver paint. Like just certain things that he did are different from like people like Dahmer and whatnot.
Sure.
But it is heard of nowadays.
Yeah, because like even 20 years later, you've got Ted Bundy that comes through and he was going back to the graveyard. Or like Green River Killer, where he's also going back to where he's leaving those bodies.
Yeah.
They, I think, maybe understood that a little bit more than the 1950s when this happened.
Yeah.
Like it was more expected maybe by the time Ted Bundy and Green River Killer came through. It blew them away for sure when this happened.
And now with social media and television and all of that, it's just a lot more exposed.
Yep.
Everybody's exposed to like crazy things that happen in the world. You'll hear about what happened on the total opposite end of the world.
Well, and also, I'm not sure that this area would be as rural today as it was then, but you've still got like Google Maps that drives by or it goes overhead like Google Earth. Can you imagine the stuff that they see sometimes?
Yeah.
Like you could almost have caught him doing something strange if it had happened today.
Mm-hmm.
And he was out there walking around in his skin suit.
Yeah. Those neighbors must have been like pretty far away from him and his farm for him to just be walking around.
There's one 1/4 mile away, but that's like one family that's 1/4 mile away. Everybody else is miles away. The town is miles away.
Yeah. So the media caught on to the story before the weekend was over. Unsure what was found in the house, a district attorney implied there must be cannibalism involved. Suddenly, the newspapers were reporting that Ed was planning on curing Bernice's legs in the summer kitchen and was storing quarts of blood in the cellar. Dozens of national and international reporters and photographers arrived in Plainfield.
After asking for a slice of pie with cheddar cheese on top, Ed finally broke a 30-hour silence and admitted to the murder of Bernice Worden. He took a bite of the pie, stated the cheese was too dry, but proceeded to confess to the horrible crimes.
Who eats apple pie with cheddar cheese, any cheese, on apple pie?
This is Wisconsin, baby. It's all about the cheese. I thought that was the most Wisconsin thing that man could have done.
They stick that cheese on everything.
I have been to Wisconsin, and yes, it was lots of cheese curds and beer. They really like their beer in Wisconsin.
I mean, it's a good, they go hand in hand.
With some pretzels. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Also, it's gorgeous in Wisconsin. Absolutely beautiful.
Ed had taken a glass jug into the hardware store and purchased a half-gallon of antifreeze. He handed Bernice a $1 bill, and she gave him back a penny change. Ed also remembers Bernice speaking about the opening of hunting season, but after that, the next thing Ed remembered was dragging Bernice's body across the store floor. He loaded her into the warden's truck and drove the truck into a wooded area before walking back to the town and getting his own car. He drove to the woods and moved Bernice's body into his car. According to Ed, he was in a daze or trance and simply didn't remember the murder or anything other than hanging Bernice.
It was pretty clear to law enforcement by that time what had happened to Bernice during Ed's dazed time. They were also concerned about the other human remains, like the 12 skulls that were found. Ed said to his knowledge he hadn't murdered anyone else. The other remains were from nighttime grave robbing. For over 5 years, he had been visiting 3 different cemeteries at least 40 times to grave rob. He usually left without opening any caskets, but on at least 9 occasions, he did steal the remains of recently deceased women.
Ed read the obituaries, and when he found a middle-aged or older woman who resembled Augusta, he would head out to the cemetery in the middle of the night to dig up their remains. He promised officials, though, that the graves were left in apple pie order. What the hell is his obsession with apple pies? Is it a Wisconsin thing?
All-American snack. Don't worry about the grave robbing. It's an apple pie order, officer. Ed was escorted back to his farm, where he gave law enforcement a tour of the farmhouse, outbuilding, and some of the land. After the tour, Ed was taken to the courthouse, where he was charged with armed robbery for the theft of $41 from the warden's cash register. Investigators were pending charges for murder, but filed theft charges to hold Ed while they continued searching for evidence.
There are 4 other disappearances that occurred in Wisconsin about the same time, and with the remains of so many people in Ed's house, law enforcement decided to look into those disappearances as well.
8-year-old Georgia Weckler was dropped off at the top of her driveway after school on May 1st, 1947. She never made it to her Jefferson, Wisconsin home, and she was never seen from again. A black Ford sedan was seen speeding off from the area at the same time Georgia disappeared. It's 110 miles one way from Plainfield to Jefferson, Wisconsin, and according to Ed, he hadn't left Plainfield but once for the draft physical examination.
15-year-old Evelyn Hartley disappeared 6 years later in 1953. Evelyn was babysitting a 20-month-old baby in La Crosse on October 24th. She called her parents to check in every time she babysat, but when she didn't call or answer the phone, her dad drove over to the house. Evelyn's father found a footprint and blood by the basement steps. Police suspect that someone broke in through the basement and drug Evelyn out through the basement window. Her bloody underwear were found 2 miles from the house, but Evelyn's body has never been found. A denim jacket and a pair of tennis shoes were found that appeared to have been abandoned by the attacker. The shoes were a size 11.5 and Ed wore an 8. Every skull found in Ed's house was reviewed to confirm it was not Georgia or Evelyn. No clothes or other small bones were found. Georgia and Evelyn's disappearances have not been solved, and at this time there is no evidence that Ed was involved.
2 hunters, Victor Travis and Ray Burgess, disappeared in November 1952. They had permission to hunt on a neighbor's property. Witnesses reported the 2 stopped for beers at Mac's Bar in Plainfield before getting in Ray's car and driving away. The 2 men and car have never been located. It's possible that the 2 men wandered onto Ed's property and were murdered. By all accounts, only women's remains have been located, but we'll never know for sure. In 1960, an investigator found that Ray Burgess was a fake name, associated with the Chicago mob. The car owned by Ray was also purchased under a fake name. Victor had been friends with the mob boss's son, Dominic. Victor had been drinking with Dominic just 2 months earlier when Dominic flipped his truck and died. Since then, there have been 2 prior attempts on Victor's life. This seems like the more likely cause of Victor's disappearance.
Back to Ed Gein here, he also denied having anything to do with Mary Hogan's disappearance. That was until one of the deputies found her skinned face in a paper bag. The search continued through Ed's house, and the number of remains kept climbing to a suspected 15. The evidence was removed from Ed's house and sent to the crime lab. There was so much evidence it took 2 officers 30 trips and a half hour to unload the truck. As the evidence piled up, Ed would finally admit to killing both Mary and Bernice. He never admitted to killing Bernice intentionally, though. He says it was accidental. Ed also took a lie detector test for Evelyn and Georgia, and it confirmed he was not involved in either disappearances.
The house was boarded up and no trespassing signs were posted. Around-the-clock supervision of the house was also provided by the sheriff's department to stop college parties. Ed's story was big news in that fall of 1957. The world watched as he was charged with first-degree murder and armed robbery.
Ed had provided officials with 8 or 9 names of his graves he had robbed. The community refused to believe that Ed's actions went beyond murder. He simply couldn't have been grave robbing for years without their knowledge. It also seemed impossible for Ed to have dug down 6 feet in the dead of night. As we're about to discuss, graves are not 6 feet below the surface like we would assume. The box or concrete surrounding the coffin is about 2 feet below the surface, and the coffin is closer to 6 feet.
Investigators had no choice but to dig up the graves to determine if Ed's story was true. They started at the grave of Eleanor Adams. Eleanor died in August 1951. Ed told his attorney he had removed her remains before the grave had been fully filled in. 2 gravediggers set to work, digging up Eleanor's coffin. It took them an hour to reach the box cover, which had been split in 2. They removed the box to access the coffin, and what they found horrified them. The coffin was empty, except for a 12-inch crowbar that had been left inside.
So I wonder if that box was like concrete. Was it just like a box, regular box, covering the coffin, or was it like concrete box covering the coffin? Because how would Ed split that in 2?
Yeah, in Eleanor's case, this one is, I believe, wood.
Okay.
And also, guess he didn't leave it in apple pie order. He literally left his tools behind.
They filled Eleanor's grave back in and proceeded to the second grave of the day. This grave was of 69-year-old Mabel Everson. Mabel had died a few months before Eleanor, in April 1951. They started to dig but didn't make it to the coffin. Approximately 15 inches below the surface were human bones, a wedding ring, and clothing. The bones were relocated and the dig continued. Once inside the coffin, it was also empty. Along with his confession to the grave robbing, Ed had confessed to having a guilty conscience occasionally and returning the remains to their graves.
During the investigation, only those 2 graves were opened. We'll never know for sure how many graves Ed robbed. Augusta's grave was not included in the investigation, and it does not appear that it had been disturbed.
When asked about necrophilia, Ed said that he was disgusted because the corpses smelled too bad. Investigators had mixed feelings about the necrophilia. Ed has multiple characteristics of other necrophiliacs, like an obsession with their hair and the inability to make advances on a living woman. Augusta had ranted and taught so severely that sex was evil, but that masturbation was acceptable. We don't know for a fact what he did, but Ed never admits to necrophilia.
Ed also thought that he had the power to raise the dead. An evil spirit spoke to Ed and forced him to the cemetery when it was time to raise the dead. After that evil spirit left him, he would occasionally return those remains.
Ed was sent to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane for a 30-day examination beginning on November 25th. The Central State Hospital was an all-male maximum security hospital. The physical exam found that he had a swollen lymph gland and the growth on his eyelid, but was in good health. He was 5 feet tall and weighed 141 pounds.
Ed complained of the smell of the hospital. When asked to expand on the smell, Ed said that
it smells like flesh.
Gnarly.
Yuck. I mean, he had to have lied here, right? I mean, his whole house was filled with flesh. You telling me that a hospital is smelling like flesh, Ed? It just doesn't... Whatever.
Yeah, you would think it would smell like antiseptic?
Yeah, like
cleaners?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the opposite of what he's used to for sure. But he complains about it consistently for the rest of his life. Ed's intelligence was tested during his examination period. His IQ was 99, a low average, but according to the psychologist that was providing the examination, he felt Ed's IQ was higher and closer to the bright normal level. Ed had a good vocabulary and was able to reason, but there was a large gap between his verbal IQ and his performance level IQ. This indicated he had a strong emotional disturbance.
The evaluation summarized by saying Ed had a strict religious code that he expected others to follow. He had an impressionable personality, but beneath had an aggressiveness that presented an inappropriate actions.
Ed was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and while he knew the difference between right and wrong, he was not always capable of making the right choice. The 30-day examination was completed on December 22nd, and it was recommended that Ed remain at the Central State Hospital.
In general, Ed's neighbors felt that Ed was smarter and more manipulative than the hospital gave him credit for. They had known Ed almost his whole life and agreed that he was a strange man, but if he had murdered those women, it wasn't from insanity. They felt that Ed was getting away with murder.
On November 29th, law enforcement was back at Ed's farm to investigate a garbage trench about a quarter of a mile from the house. Ed's closest neighbor had reported that he would go to the trench with shovels at all hours, but they assumed he was taking trash. The trench was almost 40 feet long, but it didn't take more than an hour for the almost full skeletal remains of a woman to be found. She was estimated to be between 30 to 50 years old, with a gold tooth, and possibly had been removed from her grave.
On January 6, 1958, Ed was back in court for his sanity hearing. The courtroom was packed with journalists, photographers, family of the victims, and Ed's neighbors. The court would be dependent upon the Central State evaluation to determine Ed's sentencing. The psychiatrists felt that Ed should not be held criminally responsible for his actions. Dr. Milton Miller was quoted on stand.
I think he would know the right side of a plate on which to put a knife and fork. I think he would know to stand up when the judge comes in. I think he would know to be respectful to an older person.
He continued by saying Ed would probably agree,
"It is wrong to kill people. It is wrong to uncover graves."
Due to Ed's schizophrenia, he did not put the same weight on the larger decisions that someone else might. He knew it was wrong to grave rob, but in his mind, the neighbor who beat the puppy and was living with a woman, unmarried, was a larger problem.
All three experts from Central State reported that Ed was chronically mentally ill and possibly borderline insane. Ed was sentenced to an indeterminate term at Central State Hospital. If he recovered, he could still be brought to a full criminal trial. Ed was driven in the sheriff's personal 1957 Plymouth back to Central State. The journalists and photographers followed behind. While waiting outside the hospital, the photographers gathered around to get one last picture of Ed. For the first time, Ed wouldn't let them take photos. He was forceful and adamant, simply saying, "Oh, not anymore." Then he walked down the admissions hallway and was gone.
In some ways, Ed's life improved at Central State. He had 3 meals a day and improved living conditions. He was assigned a job like mopping or laundry, with wages up to 50 cents a week. The money could be spent at the hospital canteen on snacks of his choice. He also had a TV, library, and radio available.
Ed was sued by Eleanor Adams' widower for mental anguish for $5,000. With Ed in the hospital earning up to 50 cents a week and law enforcement unable to keep 24-hour surveillance on the property, the farm and personal property were scheduled for auction on March 30th, 1958.
The auction never occurred because at 2:30 a.m. on March 20th, Ed's 9-bedroom farmhouse would be burned to the ground. The farm buildings were saved, but the house itself was a total loss. With no electricity in the house, the fire was clearly arson. No one was overly sad to see the house go, and an investigation did not turn up any suspects.
The auction did go ahead for the farmland, equipment, and Ed's car. The 195-acre farm was sold for $3,883 to a real estate developer. The new owner hired a team to remove the remaining buildings, and 60,000 trees were planted on the land. A local junk dealer purchased the farm equipment.
The 1949 maroon Ford that Ed owned, used for grave robbing and transporting Bernice's body, was sold for $760 to a pair of brothers. This $760 would be the equivalent of $8,500 today, and was a strangely high amount to pay for a used vehicle. It made more sense when just 4 months later, the car showed up as the Ed Gein Ghoul car at a Wisconsin county fair.
The buyer had put a pair of wax dummies in the car, one for Ed and one for Bernice. 20,000 people paid $250 to see the car in just a couple of days, earning the brothers $6,000 in profit before the buyer was driven out of the state. Wisconsin was not a good place for them to start this type of business.
Apparently, we need to be buying serial killers' cars or something of that nature to make a profit from it.
That was $6,000 in 1958. I don't know what that equivalent is today.
That had to be a lot.
I should have looked that up.
Yeah.
But they way more than made their money in that couple of days.
Yeah. The auction itself brought in $5,375, which was given to the families who had sued Ed. $300 was set aside for the burial expenses for Ed. In 1960, Alfred Hitchcock released the film Psycho, based on the Robert Bloch 1959 book of the same title. It skyrocketed Ed's name back into the spotlight because he was the true name behind Norman Bates. The movie and book created a different view of schizophrenia as split or multiple personalities. Norman couldn't allow his mother, Norma, to die. In Ed's case, he had been living in a fog, unable to think or feel clearly.
The same year, workers at the old farm planting trees found more bones where the barn would have been. The ribs, legs, arm, and pelvic bones were sent to the crime lab for storage. The remains of all of Ed's unknown victims would be buried together in a cemetery plot in December 1962.
10 years after his first trial, Ed was finally considered competent to stand trial. The first day was Monday, January 22, 1968. Again, the court was at max capacity with the victims' families and the media. Ed was shy and nervous at trial. He entered pleas of not guilty for Bernice Worden's murder and not guilty by reason of insanity for charges to determine if he was sane at the time of her death.
The trial officially began on November 7, 1968, almost 11 years after Bernice's November 16, 1957 murder. 7 witnesses took the stand for the prosecution, including law enforcement statements from November 16th. Ed took the stand in his own defense, confessing that he had killed Bernice, but it was an accident. Ed stated that he put a .22 short bullet into the magazine to confirm it would fit in the gun he was considering for purchase. The gun then accidentally went off, striking Bernice. He did not remember dragging Bernice to the truck, walking back to town, picking up his own car, or the events that occurred at his home.
Just 7 days after the trial began, Ed would be found guilty of murdering Bernice Worden. Judge Gallmer declared Ed's actions immediately after the shooting made it hard to believe her death had occurred from an accidental shooting.
The second trial to determine Ed's sanity began right away. Within a couple of hours and 2 witness statements, Ed would be found not guilty by reason of insanity. This was a unique sentence, since Ed was guilty of murder, but also acquitted due to insanity. What it really meant was another indeterminate sentence at Central State Hospital. If Ed was ever deemed sane and no longer a danger to society, he could be released.
Ed was never tried for the murder of Mary Hogan. The state decided it wasn't in the budget for another trial when Ed had confessed to shooting Mary, loading her body onto a sled, and dragging her body back to his house. The news coverage of Mary Hogan's death did bring about some resolution. Mary's daughter, Christine, had been searching for her mother for years. She had traced her to Chicago, but then didn't know what had happened to her. Christine saw a photo of Mary in the paper and learned of her mother's tragic death.
Before returning to the hospital, Ed did give a short interview. He stated he was relieved to be going back to the hospital because they treated you pretty good there.
In 1974, at 67 years old, Ed petitioned the courts for release. Ed stated that he was fully recovered and didn't need to remain at the hospital any longer. Ed said that he had spent 17 years at the hospital and was feeling trapped. He had $300 saved up, and as a handyman, he could find a job doing most trades.
A hearing was held on June 27th. Ed and multiple doctors made statements in front of Judge Gilmer. One psychiatrist had spent years with Ed. He reported that Ed never caused issues at the hospital and was usually mild-mannered, but Ed's mental disorder was right below the surface.
The psychiatrist asked Ed to explain some well-known proverbs. When presented with "don't cry over spilled milk," Ed said it meant don't dig up the past, what's done is done. When asked to explain "a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush," Ed laughed and said,
"If you have a bird in your hand, you might squeeze him too much and kill him."
In the end, Ed's petition was rejected. Even if Ed truly was no longer a danger to society, the daily tasks like buying food or renting an apartment would be outside of his capabilities after so many years in the hospital.
4 years later, Ed would kind of get his wish to leave Central State. The hospital was converted into a correctional facility, and Ed was transferred to Mendota Mental Health Institute in Madison, Wisconsin.
Ed was 77 years old when he died of respiratory failure on July 26, 1984. He was buried at Plainfield Cemetery in the plot beside his mother, father, and brother. Ed's grave marker had been stolen multiple times, and the grave is now only marked with a small cross and some flowers.
In addition to Psycho, Ed was the inspiration for Leatherface in Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs. If you want to know more about Ed, I would recommend the book Deviant, The Shocking True Story of Ed Gein by Harold Schechter. I read the book for this research, and it covers more in depth what life was like at the time and how Ed viewed the world. So the question remains, was Ed Gein truly evil, or was he a severely mentally ill man? We would love for you to become part of the Corrupt crew. You can find us on Patreon with multiple tiers and PayPal. This will score you our appreciation and will announce your name in a future episode. Both links are in the episode notes. Case suggestions and feedback can be emailed to us at corruptpod@gmail.com.
The sources for this episode would be listed in the episode notes. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Threads. Don't forget to subscribe to catch our new Corrupt content. Please also leave us a review wherever you're listening to this episode. Bye!
Bye!